So let's get started. People may trickle in, and then of course there will be people watching asynchronously. So welcome to Interintellect, and to for those of you whose first salon it is, a very special welcome. So basically, what's going to happen is that Nicolette and I are going to talk, do a sort of formal Q&A for a little bit under an hour. At which point we open it up to questions. So either Jeremy, at any point, if you do have questions earlier, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll start with those when we enter sort of audience Q&A portion. And then the hope is that it turns into more of a discussion. So without further ado, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Nicolette Polek to Intellect. Nicolette is the author of Imaginary Museums, which came out in 2020 from Soft Skull Press, and her recent debut novel, Bitter Water Opera, which came out from Grey Wolf in April. She is the recipient of the 2019 Rona Jaffe Writers Award, and her work has been published in the Paris Review Daily, Balm, New York Tyrant, Spike Art Magazine, and elsewhere. She holds a BA from Bennington College and an MFA from the University of Maryland College Park. And am I right in saying another master's from Yale Divinity? That is more recent?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I had the extraordinary pleasure of reading Bitter Water Opera in anticipation of this conversation. And I was delighted and surprised to find that the sort of this character on whom it is based is a real person. So how did you first come across Marta Beckett, whose extremely poetic and novelistic life forms a kind of background for this novel?
Thank you for the introduction, Tara, and for having me. I found Marta Beckett on accident. I found her on an app, basically. I found her on this app called Roadside America, which is somewhat similar to Atlas Obscura, somewhat of a compendium of obscure landmarks and labors of love that you can visit, tourist attractions that are lesser traveled. I was I was actually driving from College Park, Maryland to Ohio, and I was looking for places to stop because it's somewhat of a tedious drive, and I was making it quite often. And Roadside America is a little bit, it's not as advanced as Atlas Obscura. It seems it's a little bit more community driven. So I was looking at the whole of their collection of sites, and I found her opera house through that. But it wasn't, I mean, I was first initially excited and really fascinated by the opera house itself and the images of the murals that she made on the inside. But I think, even more interested in her because a lot of the comments on the app disparaged her quite a bit, or there were people who had found the opera house when they were in Las Vegas or other places, and they were expecting something far more professional, and they were a little bit, I think, put off and disturbed by seeing what was at the time like a 85-year-old woman dancing ballet in the middle of the desert. And it was a little bit, and I became instantly very defensive, I think, on her behalf. And so I started reading a lot about her. I watched this biography, or this documentary rather, and then I read her autobiography, To Dance in Sands. And somewhere in that process, I felt that I wanted to write maybe a abstract portrait of her, or I had read Fleur Yeagy's These Possible Lives, which is a collection of 3 microbiographies of John Keats, Thomas de Quincey. I'm forgetting the third one now, but each one is about 15 pages long, and they're very condensed. And so I'd considered that I would do something very similar. So I was writing out all these very poetic and compressed images based on her life, and slowly in the process became a little not suspicious of her narrative of her own life, but had a lot of questions. So what initially was her, I guess, her intention of going into the desert to build this beautiful thing for other people to encounter, slowly became her downfall, or she became very depressed. She became very angry with people. She basically in some way wanted to make this opera house as a way to prove herself for her father. in the eyes of her father. So there was a lot of pain and a lot of it was a harder portrait than I initially expected, and it wasn't always directly spoken about. And she also didn't exactly directly speak about it herself, so a lot of it was buried in details. And I no longer felt like I could take this part of her life and present it as a biographer. So I decided to make it fiction. I created another character, Gia, who is the first person perspective, to kind of take on those qualities, to take on the qualities of the depression, the despondency, the desire to be loved by other people, and her father and her former lovers, etc. And kind of created a fractured version of Marta Beckett between these two characters so that they could then have a conversation with each other. And through the process of the novel, our first person narrator can redeem or turn away or in some way, yes, overcome that part of Marta that I was perceiving when I was reading about her. So that's how I found her, and how it became what was once a biographical fascination, something much larger.
And I'm curious, so your language is intensely richly sensual and poetic. There's a kind of somewhere between microscopic and kaleidoscopic level of detail that I loved as a reader. And that sort of also creates these scenes or these images that I don't know if you've ever seen any films by Parajanov, but this sort of almost like there's a sense of we're never quite sure what is real in a way that is less about the narrative than about the kind of a non-literal transposition of reality, which is something that I really responded to. Was the voice of the novel, was the kind of specific approach to language something that is sort of, you might consider your voice already, or was it something that you developed for this project?
It's definitely my voice already. I didn't hear the filmmaker that you just mentioned.
Sergei Parajanov. He's this sort of Armenian, Georgian, Soviet filmmaker who kind of is inspired. Basically, all of his frames look like icons, and he has this sort of very intense, rich visual style where it's surrealist is almost is the common word, but the not entirely the right word. It's just sort of there's an intense richness of paying attention to everything, so that everything you're seeing something that's clearly not exactly literal, but is not a fantasy or a fairy tale or surrealist in a kind of nonsensical way. It feels internally consistent. I'm thinking there's a scene where like later in the novel where I think Gia's already at the hotel and she's turning a faucet and the faucet comes off in her hand, and it feels like something almost out of a nature horror film, and yet in a beautiful way. So yeah, I'm curious sort of how much of this voice it is how you write versus this is a story I'm telling that demands this voice.
Yes, well, again, it's very much how I think I see the world. The cinematic is maybe a good place to start. The Color of Pomegranates is a good cinematic corollary too, where there's, I mean, it's not exactly each one is an icon, but each frame or each scene.
Yeah, no, that's Parajanov.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Yes,
I wanted to really look this up. Well, that's great. That's a very good and insightful, and maybe even you mentioning the detail of turning the faucet and the root coming through does seem kind of like that. Each scene has one like central plot or one central image that it's focused on. I do also like, speaking of icons, the way that there's a wonderful Russian polymath, Pavel Florensky. He was a mathematician and a priest, but also he wrote extensively about art, specifically the difference between Eastern and Western icons. He kind of coined the term, I suppose, reverse perspective or inverse perspective. And I am quite inspired by that. So his idea with reverse perspective is that when you're looking at an Eastern icon, there is no vanishing point. There's no shadows. because there's no time, as opposed to a Western icon where there is a vanishing point at the end of, or like within the frame. And therefore you have the shadows that is in relation to the vanishing point. But the vanishing point with the Eastern icon is outside the frame. It's where the viewer is standing, or if I were to kind of transpose this to a kind of literature, it would be where the reader is standing. And so one, there's no shadows. Two, there's things that are far away are brought forward are much bigger. Things that are close are very small. It's kind of the reverse. And as the person who's perceiving the image, they become a part of the image, or they're swallowed up into the image. And so that allows for a lot of multiplicity or different proportions, or I think of this reverse perspective similarly to, for example, defamiliarization, which is like a Shklovsky idea where you make the familiar strange by putting lots of objects that are otherwise not typically put in juxtaposition or juxtaposed together, or put in conversation together. So I delight in kind of finding these rich details in the world, and I keep a notebook. I keep a prayer journal as well as like an observation notebook, and often will put many different contrasting images or contrasting ideas in the same frame together, so that you have but have similar kind of patterns or spiritual significance, or so what seem like very different ideas from different times in my life, or different aesthetic ideas can then be kind of brought together and create a new and strange experience of something familiar. So I think perhaps that's a craft way of going about your question. But the voice is very, I mean, I didn't do much to mask the voice. And I think that's just how I write with first person. Maybe it was very different with my first book, where when I was writing a perspective that I was very unfamiliar with, I would take on the first person perspective so I could figure it out or find it out. And anything that I was familiar with, I would give it to the third person perspective, because it's something that I could see from the outside. But this time I just gave my own perspective first person, so that I could most easily transcribe what it's like to turn towards maybe God in a very small way.
So this is delightful, because my next question was going to be about your first book. So your first book was a collection of short stories. And as you approached Bitterwater Opera, particularly as a novel, I'm curious what were the biggest challenges, or what were the biggest points of tension in conceiving of a novel structurally rather than a short story? What was instinctive, what felt like an expansion, and what felt like completely new territory?
I worked on them at the same time, which was helpful. So they kind of bled into each other at some point. And I don't think Bitterwater Opera is a very traditional novel structure in any way. So if anything, when I was working on imaginary museums, which are also these very short scenes, that structure kind of bled into Bitterwater Opera, and I basically borrowed the same thing, but I had this freedom suddenly with the novel, that instead of having to always think of each complete shape with the short fables and imaginary museums, I could leave the end open in some way. So I was still thinking of these small capsular kind of scenes or cells, but thinking of them more like chains in a chain link that I didn't have to think about with imaginary museums, and each one really had to stand on its own. So I loved kind of continuing that same structure, but the next thing I'm writing is not fragmented at all, or it's not, it doesn't have vignettes, it doesn't have any kind of short glimpses, or so I think I've finished with that structure for now, because I've worked so intensely on it in two different ways.
So in one of the interviews, this might have been with Stephen Adubato, you talk about wanting to capture the interiority of consciousness of the decision of stepping before God. And you talk as well in I think a couple of your interviews about the challenge of particularly like the traditional Protestant conversion narrative, how there's often a kind of kitsch to accounts of conversion or accounts of the experience of God. How did you, at what point did this novel become a novel about God, or the transition toward the movement towards God? And how how did you navigate the potential for kitsch
Mm.
in such a narrative?
I didn't think it was going to be a novel about conversion at all at the beginning. I still thought it was just going to be an expanded character study of Marta Beckett. And um, when that when she split into two, when I gave Marta a conversation partner in this way, I the the main thing I was thinking about was how Marta Beckett was lacking a lot of meaning, or she desired meaning. She would always go to the brothel in town and ask the prostitutes to read her tarot cards because she desperately wanted to know what to do with her life. And when that became kind of the main thing that Gia and Marta were talking about, or like what their experience was trying to find meaning, it was easier for me to then give Gia other outlets or other possibilities for meaning, and that inevitably then leads to God. So at first, Marta's a stand-in for meaning as a distant icon or a figure, and then in the second section, Gia tries to find meaning through nature or the you know the ecological and the spiritual in that sense. And in the third section, she's just looking for meaning in art itself, or like art making as a end in itself. And none of these things, it's not like they can't give us meaning or anything like this. And you know more than I think a lot of us. I mean, a lot of your work focuses on this, Tara. But it doesn't, at least for Gia and this particular character, it didn't hold up under extreme existential despair or depression, despondency, all these things. So I think when I was in the second section, when she was alone in this cabin, that's when I decided that, well, I think she probably needs to find God. So that's when the book kind of took that turn. But that's not at all. I mean, each section was a surprise for me. I didn't know where it was going. And I think that was kind of the delight of writing it too. And I prefer not knowing what kind of novel or what kind of story I'm writing and discovering it, because that's kind of the experience of mystery and revelation as well. So as soon as I know what the full structure of a story is, then I know that I'm wrong. Unless it's the end, like, and I've reached the end of it. But I resisted kitsch. I don't know. I feel like I didn't resist kitsch. I feel like it's still somewhat sentimental, or there's places that it could have been less sentimental, and it's still something I'm battling with. But I think that defamiliarization is really a helpful tool for resisting kitsch. And even when, I guess we can go back to Shklovsky, he has a very helpful image of what defamiliarization looks like with the knight on a chessboard. In order for the knight to move forward or straight, you have to do an L shape. You have to move both forward and sideways. So I think, yeah, finding these misfit details, these strange juxtapositions in order to get at something that I just want to say straightforwardly, it allowed for me to resist kitsch. But I think I mean, I had a lot of straightforward passages at one point. I think in that interview with Stephen, I talked about how I had this just explicit prayer at the end of the book of like, this is what this character's life is now, and like what they're thanking God for. And I had shown that draft of it to my mentor at the time, Christian Wyman, and he told me that you just have to cut it. And I really resisted it, but as soon as I cut it, I saw that it was everywhere already in the book. And then I also cut up part of the prayer and then stuck it in different parts of the book too. So I really let it get soaked up. But yeah, I think that's part of it. But also, I mean, how do you resist kitsch? I think also good style, like writing well, like a good style is something that Protestant narratives aren't really looking or trying to accomplish. They're not trying to stylistically render like a religious conversion in their prose. So
I will say as a reader, I thought you resisted kitsch extremely effectively. But hearing you talk, it definitely emotionally resonated with so much of my own process as a novelist, and particularly this tension that you mentioned in your interview with Stephen as well, of what it means to be a Christian novelist. And you talk about being interested in writing about different things, and I want to ask you about what those things might be in a second. But I think one of my the biggest tensions in my work, or the biggest curiosities I have, is how do you write, or how does one write as a Christian novelist, which is to say a novelist with a set of commitments about the world and our place in it, and and a sense of the good as there being a sense of a reality that artistic creation is in dialogue with, or tends towards, or imitates, but where artistic creation is kind of not the apex of what creation might look like, without kind of ceding some of the ambition of the great novelist who, without, I mean, there, I think different novelists will have different accounts of what they're actually doing, but a sense that a sense of the power of the novel to do something, whereas I think perhaps a Christian perspective might always see a novel as having limitations. And I think that question of sentimentality for me is also one that I really struggled with, especially with Here in Avalon, because it's such a sort of all my other books are so much bloodier and darker, and then there's this sort of sweet fairy tale of a book. How does sort of love is the answer not sound sentimental? How does it not sound hokey? How does it not sound like the end of a Marvel movie or what have you? And I think that I also find that leading into the strangeness of existence in these sort of more granular ways, leading into whether it's human conversations or human frailties, or characters that might be grotesque in some ways and also deeply human. I think sometimes it feels like specificity helps move us away from a narrative that is so received that it might be kitsch if told kind of from a more zoomed out perspective, which is to say, when you're writing about individual people, when you're writing about even people in spiritual torment, there's a passion there, there's a reality there that doesn't ever get hokey, at least for me, or is easier to not be hokey. Whereas I certainly know that there were drafts of Avalon where I sort of thought, well, like, what happens has to be theologically accurate, and that means that this has to represent that, this has to represent this, and it has to be some kind of affirmation of a certain kind of truth. And every draft that I wrote with that in mind was just awful. And it was really only when I let the desire to kind of do apologetic work go that it felt like the novel had the freedom to still have the perspective of a Christian writer, without being that kind of didactic novel.
No,
but I'm curious then, did you find that the difference for you, pre and post becoming a Christian, if you want to sort of frame it like that, was it subject matter? Was it approach? How did you feel if anything, the tension or the change in your sense of a vocation as a writer?
I mean, I'd always wanted to be a writer. My mother was a librarian, and I was always just at the library. I had little books that I wrote when I learned how to write, and I put them under my radiator. It just was kind of a given. And I became a Christian right before I went into my MFA program. And I don't think I even realized what had happened to me when I was in the first 2 years of my program. It was a 3-year program. But all I knew is that I had this kind of bullheadedness, or bullishness, I'm not sure, of wanting to glorify God with my writing. And it just seemed like you could just decide to do that, and you can pray before you write, and I can just give my entire life, including my vocation, to God, because that's just my life had changed, and so everything that I do will change as a result of it. So it was somewhat of an easy shift. But yeah, I think before when I was going into the program, I already had a manuscript finished, and it was all kind of, looking back, they were all stories about people who wanted a relationship with God, even though it wasn't explicitly that, and I didn't really have the language for it at the time either, but it was still there was a lot of like God doubt and yeah, an apathetic experience of God there. But I think after I became a Christian, it just I became very excited. I had an entirely new set of references that I had never read. I mean, I hadn't read C.S. Lewis. I hadn't read Tolkien. And I still haven't read Tolkien actually. So that's still something ahead of me, or Graham Greene, or all these other Christian writers, because I've always like avoided them, like the plague. So it became a very exciting, and still I'm like in the grips. I mean, I'm just rereading Chekhov and his very liturgical short stories, and how he represents the church is so fascinating, and how that gets absorbed into his other non explicitly Christian texts are great. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, absolutely. I think you very much did. I'm trying to think. There's a question I want to ask. I'm going to go out of order precisely to answer your question, which is so. Some of the writers that you've been compared to, or Bitterwater Opera in particular, has been compared to, include Sylvia Townsend Warner and Lenora Carrington. Did you have particular influences of your own in mind when you were writing, either sort of or sense of like, this is the person who has written the novel that I want this to be as close to as possible, or that I want this to be the me version of, or were there sort of multiple texts singing in, sort of polyphonically in your mind?
no, not really. I actually just I wanted to write a book that I wanted to read, and I didn't have an example that was similar. It just but of course it didn't spring out of nowhere. I think I had a lot of cinematic references more than literary references at the time. So and I did have some kind of surrealistic and more magical realism, if being like getting in the weeds. I don't think I actually really enjoy surrealism in the same way, but magical realism, where we have a world of our we have one object that's not of our world that gets introduced into the world. That's something that I feel more interested in. That's what I wanted Bitterwater Opera to kind of fall into the tradition of. But cinematically, gosh, there's a lot of things. I really wanted the opera house, or this like the architectural spaces in the book, to have a lot of weight and meaning, and have some kind of narrative influence. So I mean, I loved Bachelard's Poetics of Space also, and that helped me think about it that way. But um Fanny Fanny and Alexander, suddenly falling out of my head. The Lutheran bishop's house was a really inspiring house that I tried to model the second section's house off of, where the characters are kind of stuck in and have these austere concerns that they have to confront in order for them to be let go or escape from the house. And then Celine and Julie Go Boating was another one that was similar, where these two characters enter into a house and they are forced to return and return back to it, seeing the same kind of traumatic memory that is left replaying in this house until they figure out who did this traumatic event that happened in this house, and then they no longer have to return to the house. So I mean, I think a lot of these small kind of pieces of film and the world that I really loved, I tried to kind of smash into the book as well. I'm trying to think of others. I mean, before I was writing books, and still I played piano, and I musically, I think that I'm very influenced, and musical structures are very interesting to me. For a while, especially with imaginary museums, I was listening to a lot of minimalist composers, and counterpoint was helpful for me to think about narrative. Romantic composers were always something that inspired my writing, where we have these very high contrasts between dynamics and different sections. And but yeah, I mean, those are all kind of places that my mind had went, but there was no book, or there was no writer that I wanted to write like in this particular way. I think maybe on a granular level, like at the sentence, I wanted to write like Joy Williams, or I wanted to write with a kind of sonic sophistication like Gordon Lish sometimes, or Gabriel Letts will talk about with the sentence is the loneliest place. So a lot of, I mean, I would go through and make sure a lot of my sentences ended on a stressed syllable, like these kinds of musical sonic things that I see. And I mean, at one point I was really, I had Gerard Manley Hopkins' Inscape voice kind of in my head, like we all do at some point, but it didn't carry through the whole book. So it's again, it's just kind of a sponge or a rag that that's whatever I was reading and interested in at the time.
So and you've mentioned before we got on sort of the public Zoom about a particular sort of process that you had involving chairs. And I would love to ask you about it in the context of a broader question, which is something that really struck me about your work is sort of this implicit interest in attention as a form of being in the world, that a sort of a hyper presence that is sort of what Geo both wants and what sort of the book at its most lyrical conveys. How, in terms of the actual writing process, do you foster that sense of attention within yourself?
Well, I try to do it as much as I can on a day-to-day, yeah, at a day-to-day level. And again, I keep my observation notebooks I have like a routine with it in the morning and the evening, and sometimes at lunch I'll check things in, and I force myself to really have to sit down somewhere if I don't have an observation from what people have said or what I had seen. Sometimes and this is something I do with my students too, I'll have us all go in the grass and find a 1 foot by 1 foot section, and they have to write a drama or a romance or something that's emerging from their scrap of grass. And I mean, there's actually quite a bit of drama that ends up coming out, sometimes romance. That was more of a thing last year for some reason. I had a more romantic group, but so if I don't have anything that I'm observing or naturally being able to filter through my day, then I force myself to sit down. And even I've started to draw, like trying to transcribe things or what I see in a way that's not natural to me. So even something, I tried to transcribe some bird calls like on the piano, just so I can understand it from a different angle. I mean, or building things or printing things with like, with rubber, or like just trying to use as many different forms of attention as I can. Sometimes it's useful for me. But yes, let's see. We were talking about the chairs because I had this routine with writing where if I had one particular section that I knew that I was writing about, for example, there was one section about the history of Death Valley Junction itself, and I had my little document with that. I had to sit in one particular chair until I finished that section, and I would return to it week after week. And then when I was finished with it, I had to find a new spot. So I had these very like conceptual connections with the spaces that I was working in, and I allowed myself to free myself of them when I was finished with them. So I think that helps me divide like the way that I see. And I mean, it might just have nothing to do with how I write, and it's just a way for me to inflict rules upon myself. But I think it's still helpful for me to have these little routines.
I certainly find that sort of a slightly ritualistic approach to writing, even a monastic approach to writing, at least personally, also allows me to think better. I've sort of gotten most of my novels have been drafted with no internet access, and I'm now sort of in a slow attempt to figure out some version of that does not require sort of not be a level of monasticism incompatible with like living with my husband in a house with internet. But I'm sort of constantly struck by the way that setting aside writing time from everyday life, particularly when sort of as a professional writer, that line becomes much blurrier than when maybe you there's a sort of another job that is your profession and writing is vocation, but already carved out. It does seem to be to kind of require constant reminders of it of the sacredness of it as opposed to just the sort of business of it as I'm discovering.
And,
So
and
oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I mean, that's the main battle for the character too in Bitterwater Opera, where she's so struck or so consumed by limerence, this like which isn't, I guess, the way that she's considering it isn't the actual classical sense of the word, but I became very interested in limerence being in opposition to attention. So it was an easy way for, I think, limerence being this thing where she can be like tied to the past or always looking elsewhere and not into her present, or having attention to her relationships, like with her mother or with the places that she's put. But I came across limerence in the process of writing Bitterwater Opera, and it was very fascinated by it because it was initially used in the context of psychology. Or so Dorothy Tenoff, this psychologist, wrote a book in like 1979 about love and limerence, and it's I guess it's kind of defined as a chronic like involuntary obsession with someone. And I was looking through many of these message boards related to limerence that Dorothy Tenoff later, like her institute, had started, and there would just be people who had known their mailman all their life, and then one day he'll say something about the weather and their entire life has changed. Like, this person now is obsessed with their mailman and they can't stop thinking about their mailman. And when they're at work, it's not even necessarily a romantic or yeah, it's not even a romantic interest. It's not like a erotic fixation. It's just suddenly they become obsessed with this person, and it's so destructive that they can no longer live their life without imagining this person embedded into it, that they can't like relate to their families anymore, or they stay at work so they can fantasize about their mailman, etc. Like so this kind of I thought a lot about this as a larger phenomenon for Gia, and how she maybe not necessarily had this like limerence for other people, but with the world, and was constantly overriding her experience of life and consciousness with these kind of nagging, corrupt desires to be elsewhere. So anyway, that I think attention was the thing that then was able to like get her back on track or remove the limerence from her, and also for me just in general. I don't exactly experience limerence in that degree, but I think attention is an antidote for something much larger of being stuck in the past or the future, or not being able to attend to the people around us. So
I was really struck by something you've said in a couple of interviews about the sort of popularity of the woman in despair novel, and particularly as a sort of millennial phenomenon. I'm thinking of My Year of Rest and Relaxation being maybe one of the most sort of notorious examples, but also in one of your interviews you talk about kind of despair being seen as perhaps more interesting or more worthy of a subject than an attempt to get out of it, or an examination of what not despairing might look like. Why do you think? Do you think that there is something sort of specific to our contemporary cultural moment that makes us drawn to the woman in despair and the woman specifically? And how in how do you frame Bitterwater Opera as a sort of, it is a woman in despair novel, and yet in this very important way it also isn't, or it doesn't follow the girl who formula?
I mean, I think about this a lot with Sheila Heti, and I think her books may be the best version of project is How Should a Person Be, which is it's a woman who came at the tail end of a marriage and I think is in the process of a divorce. It's been a long time since I read it, but and she has this kind of lateral spidering network of questions of how should a person be, how should she be, and she carries this kind of similar narrative structure with motherhood and her other books later as well. And I think there's something that's compelling, I think, to readers, especially younger people who may experience despair or just in general, this kind of fraught or unending questioning that feels like you're being productive and that you're recognizing your despair, but you don't necessarily have to take responsibility in committing to an answer that I find popular, and maybe that's just the work of philosophy in fiction and versus like a theological structure within fiction. I'm not sure, but I think I see the same kind of blueprint on many of those novels where we have this kind of exploration of many possibilities without needing to, take control of your life and actually commit to one of these answers. So it might just be a mode. I mean, part of it is a lot of these books are auto-fictional, and if you don't have a full shape of your life, then how are you supposed to kind of create a conclusion or the end in this plot? I mean, I just wanted to write a book that both addressed the severity of a woman in despair, but then also at least was able to map on to a character's consciousness what it would look like to even want to commit to an answer, even if it's not, a reader could read Bitter Water Opera and think that this isn't for them, or that religion doesn't need to, be the answer for their despair, etc. But at least present a character who decides that they're going to put their faith in an answer is something I think. I mean, fiction. Also, lots of readers and lots of writers don't like a certain ending or like a happy ending or something that's closed. There's a lot of more open-endedness in literary fiction that I think a woman in despair that has the possibility to get out of it allows. So those are just a few thoughts, but Sheila Heti, I think, is someone I was definitely thinking about and writing against, maybe in that book.
So just a couple of housekeeping notes. I'm going to ask two more questions now, and then open it up to questions. So if there's nothing yet in the chat, Jeremy, if you felt like putting something in the chat, feel free. Otherwise, if there's a Q, if you have a question to raise your hand after, also feel free. But if not, no worries. I am also happy to. I have my backup list of questions as well. So you got into this a little bit actually with your what you were saying about assignments for your students, but I was actually going to ask you about, I know you've started teaching at Bennington, teaching writing, how you approach the teaching of writing. What are some of the what do you most want to convey to your students, especially when it's sort of both in terms of workshop and in terms of exercises? What do you want them to get out of your class, and how do you think about your role as a teacher?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it depends on the course. I mean, one class that I think is that I enjoyed teaching is, I mean, because I teach introductory level workshops in every genre, then I teach an introductory workshop that covers all the genres, and then intermediate advanced workshops and sometimes literature classes as well. And I'm teaching at Sarah and Lawrence's at the same time. So there's a lot of and lots of classes, but I do really enjoy the introductory workshop where I do cover all the genres, even though that kind of seems in theory like the worst one to teach, because there's a great way, I think, of introducing students to writing through the process of showing them how to write about creative nonfiction about their lives, then about fiction, and poetry. You always use that structure as opposed to the opposite, which I think people like to teach starting with poetry because it's granular, and then you start building outward with narrative, and then you can look at your own life. But I think one thing that I really enjoy bringing students to is this idea of reverence or attention, you know, how to behold the world and be a witness to the world and be able to think about the responsibility that they have and what they see with the people that are in their lives. And I think once they're able to kind of realize that the world is there for them to really attend to with attention to see, then they can write about it in a way that has meaning, or they have to think about the meaning of what they're writing as it relates to their lives. And then when you move to fiction, they can carry that idea with stories that, you know, aren't necessarily true, but it's still the same principle. And then with poetry, it's kind of turning the dials more and more into abstraction. And so that I enjoy teaching a lot, because I like teaching students how to observe and to think and to write about their lives and what that means for fiction and poetry. Yes, that's one thing. And I mean, I don't know, teaching sometimes feels very it does feel almost like I'm still trying to figure out what kind of a teacher I am, because I love working with students. I love showing them ways to be in the world and how they can kind of put that in writing, or what language has to do with any of it. So
Slightly.
If I may interject,
yeah.
sorry, I did not expect to be an audience at 1, and I have to leave at 6 o'clock.
Okay.
But this has been a very fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. I mean, the idea of attention and attending, that really fascinates me, and I think it's spot on as far as, you know, that lack or that loss in, you know, in our society, it's not being cultivated and whatnot, is definitely has something to do with, yeah, the loss of meaning as well. I mean, there's so many different questions I want to ask. I'm trying to figure out the best one to utilize my time that I have here. I mean, do you think that's kind of priority number 1 today for trying to rebuild something like that? I mean, is that, and maybe even in some sort of historical grander view, as far as like, what is the cause of the loss of attention? Like, where, like, what's the mechanism that has got us to this kind of place, I suppose, as far as you know, it is some sort of death of God thing. I don't know. I have so many, like I said, these are all very vast questions. Feel free to pick up any of those threads. Yeah.
Well, I do think it's priority number 1 in a way for me. Especially a lot of my students come into workshops thinking that writing is a therapeutic endeavor. It's something that is serving for the self, and I think orienting it towards the world is already such a vastly different orientation for them to understand. But I think reverence is also such I mean, none of my students really even know what reverence is, or they think of it as this kind of scary word that relates to the word reverend, or, you know, like, so but in order for them to understand reverence, they have to think about their relation to objects and things and people, which is they don't impose themselves upon the things that they're observing, that they have to step away from it in order to fully see something, in order to fully observe something, or even understand it. You have to kind of let it be itself. And I think our culture is so focused on what can I get out of what I'm seeing, or what can I get out of this conversation or this relationship? How does it relate to me? How does it serve me? That it's hard to actually look at something reverently. I mean, I think I'm at this point, I'm borrowing from like Dietrich von Hildebrand in The Art of Living, which is where he kind of maps out all the virtues in life, and how reverence is kind of at the bottom of the foundation of everything, in order to be like truthful and good or kind or patient. Like, one must still have like reverence for other people. Tara, I feel like you could have maybe a better explanation of how we got here, though. I don't want to.
I mean, I'm always so. One of the things that I find really interesting, so Charles Taylor just published this wonderful new book on poetry called Cosmic Connections. If you haven't read it yet, I recommend it. It's long, but very readable. And one of the arguments that he makes that I'm very in sympathy with is the sense that there's some kind of shift from the idea that art, this is super reductionist, this is about that art goes from something where we're trying to sort of either glorify God but capture reality however imperfectly, that there's a sort of asymptotic relationship to what we can express to a created order that is sort of more wondrous than we can possibly imagine. And sort of then we post-enlightenment, post a sort of widespread religious shift in how we see the world, that begins to change. And Charles Taylor's mostly interested in this sort of early romantic post-enlightenment 1790s German group of poets, although Herder and Novalis. But this idea that like there is something about artistic expression that co-creates reality, that it's not just that we're sort of using language and we're trying to kind of get it right imperfectly, but that reality is shifting in accordance with what we're saying. And I think Taylor is sort of very sympathetic to a kind of still quite theologically infused version of this. And I think at its best, sort of the contemporary vision of the artist is in dialogue with that somehow there is some kind of enchantment to our words, that in using words, we are doing something that it's divine, but it's also sort of what makes us human in insofar as if you're working within a Christian or a Jewish tradition, we are in the image and likeness of God. But then I think, as Taylor would argue, and I would argue probably even more strongly than Taylor, the further you get away from the sense that there is something there, that there's a kind of reality to the created order, I think it becomes easy to think of that like the power of words or the power of language is that you can just create reality, and that because sort of reality, like the outside reality, has no inherent meaning, the artistic act or the creative act is one of kind of total sovereignty. And I think one of the interesting kind of questions for a Christian writer now, or any writer working within a like realist tradition of like there's something out there, is how do we like argue for expression in writing, maybe not quite self-expression or therapeutic expression, but argue that there's something meaningful there that is like, how do we sort of restore the goodness of the novel or defend the goodness of the novel while maintaining that, while not kind of ceding its total power? And often I think the novels that do that, like Dostoevsky, are better novels. So I don't think you have to pick between being a great writer and being a Christian writer, but I think that's a tension in like inherent in the novel form, is like how much can humans say and how right will we be when we say it? And at any point we have to run, Jeremy. We don't want to keep you talking about theological aesthetics when you have.
I wish I didn't have to run. I would love to have this conversation with you guys.
Thanks so much for being here.
Yes, thank you for coming.
It seems like somehow, at the very least, that this perspective, I don't want to use that word, but that this approach to the world and to writing and to art is somehow the new countercultural way of being. And I think that has something to do with the fact that the bohemian bourgeois, which both kind of uses the world in a way, both from the side of economics or from the side of this perspectival subjectivity, is they've collapsed in on each other, and that what you two are putting forth seems to be some sort of new way, even though it's an old way of seeing the world. But I wonder what its ability to really become something greater than simply a niche counterculture is. I hope that it does. And I look forward to continuing to engage with your work. So till hopefully next time. Yes.
Oh, buy Bitterwater Opera before you go, or yes. Once you've gone, buy it tonight. Available from Grey Wolf. All right. Have a good night, Jeremy.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Jeremy.
Likewise.